Well, welcome to Youth Group, guys. I'm so excited that you guys are here tonight because, I know how hard it can be to come to Youth Group. I know how hard it can be when you've got a busy life, when you've got things going on, or maybe it's your first time here and you're thinking, I don't know anybody here. We're so glad that you are here because we believe that Jesus can change everything in your life. And we believe that coming to Youth Group, coming to church can be a fresh start that a lot of you need. And so we want to welcome you. We're so glad to have you here. And tonight we are starting a brand new series called Gospel Culture. And we're calling this Gospel Culture because I believe that Jesus can change everything. When we put the gospel into our culture, when we put the gospel into who we are as people, what I mean by the gospel is that Jesus died for our sins and he forgave us for our sins. When we believe that, it changes everything inside of us, right? It makes us humble people. It makes us merciful people. It makes us a loving people, because if we can recognize that there's a God who loves us, there's a God who sent his son Jesus to die for us, that we could be forgiven, like we are that loved. If we receive that love, if we take in that love, man, we can change everything around us. And I want to have a gospel culture. And I believe that this is what Jesus has called us to do, to build a culture from the church outside into the world, but to build a culture that revolves around mercy, that revolves around humility, that revolves around love. And if we can do this, we can absolutely change the world. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about being humble and how this relates to our happiness. We're going to go through a sermon that Jesus preached. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's one of the most powerful sermons that Jesus ever preached because he was flipping upside down everybody's perspective about what it meant to be happy. And I want to ask you that question in your personal life. What do you think it takes to be happy? What do you think you need in life to be happy? Like if you could just close your eyes and imagine like your ideal life and what you think happiness means, what do you have? What does it mean to be happy? For some of us, it's a state championship, right? If we finally win that state championship, we'd feel like we're on top of the world. For some of us, man, it's a beautiful girlfriend or it's a really muscular boyfriend, right? Like we want that person. We want that significant other in our life. For some of us, we want to make our parents happy. If our parents just looked at us and said, I'm proud of you or I love you, like that would change everything. And these are really good things. These are things that, right, we would love to strive for. But what Jesus is about to preach, and the sermon that we're about to hear, and we're only going to read one verse, but what Jesus is about to say is going to flip upside down our whole perspective of what it means to be happy. I love when you go to Dairy Queen, right, and you order a Blizzard, and just before they hand it to you, they always flip it upside down. And every time they do that, I'm like, cool, man, don't really care, right? Flipping upside down my Blizzard. If it falls, just get me a new one. But like, why are you doing this, right? But this is what Jesus is doing. He's flipping upside down our whole perspective of what it means to be happy and our whole perspective of what it means to be a good person in this life. And so let's read the very first verse of Jesus' sermon. And it's very short, but there's so much truth. There's so much impact just in this one verse. So the very first thing that he said in the sermon, he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, that word blessed means to be happy. We use that word all the time, right? Like we always say like hashtag blessed, or we're feeling really blessed. There's people with tattoos that say blessed, right? But this word, if we truly break down what it means, because it has a lot of definitions, I think, today. This word, what it truly means is it means to be happy. It means to be joyful. It means to be content. And if you could just close your eyes and picture, right, like what does it look like in your life to be happy? What do you need to be happy? Jesus is telling us right here what it means to be blessed, what it means to be happy. And what does he say that it means? He's saying if you want to be happy, if you want to have the good life, if you want to truly be content, if you want to truly feel good about who you are and where your life is, you have to be poor in spirit. Now, that's kind of a spiritual phrase, right? That's kind of an ambiguous phrase that we might not fully understand what Jesus is talking about if we don't know what it means to be poor in spirit. Now, here's what it means to be poor in spirit. There's one simple word that we can use, and it's humility. We have to be humble people. We have to be people who aren't thinking too much of ourselves, who aren't thinking that we're the best, and we can't be chasing, all the significance, because trying to find happiness in the world, you're never going to find it, right? So many of us are trying to chase clout. We're trying to chase significance. We're chasing what brands that we need to wear to finally be happy or to be cool or whatever it is. Some of us are chasing grades. Some of us are chasing approval from others. There's so many different ways that we're trying to find happiness in life. But what Jesus is trying to say in this sermon, he's saying, hey, stop looking at the world. Stop looking at what things you can have or what people you have in your life. Those people aren't going to bring you true happiness. The things that you're wearing, having AirPods or wearing Drew House, like those things are not going to bring you this true happiness. But what can bring you true happiness is when you are poor in spirit and when you are humble. And that phrase, poor in spirit, while it means humble, I believe it goes even deeper than just baseline humility. Because to be poor is to be in poverty. Right now, Jesus isn't calling us to be poor financially. That's not what he's saying. Like, it's okay to have money. It's okay to be poor, but he's not calling us to be poor financially. What he's calling us to be is to be poor in our spirits, almost to be like in poverty in our spirits. Now, what do you think of when you think of poverty? I don't know about you, but for me, when I think of poverty, I think of kids who are living in third world countries and they're in slums and they're starving. And Jesus isn't calling us to be poor financially, right? But what he's calling us to be is to have poverty in our spirits. And what that phrase means, because this sounds really, really abstract, it sounds really ambiguous, but what Jesus is trying to say is that people who are living in poverty, they're dependent on other people, right? Like they need countries like America. They need people like America to come over and to help them, to supply food for them. And it's not because they're lesser people, it's just because they're in a situation where they can't fully provide for themselves. And this is the state of being which God calls us to be with him. He's saying, hey, you might have certain things, you might be rich, you might be wealthy, you might have people around you, but all of those things, they're not going to bring you true happiness. What's going to bring you true happiness is to be dependent on God. What's going to bring you true happiness is to recognize and to be humble, but to recognize that you can't do this whole thing that we call life by yourself. You need God. You need to be dependent on him. And so we have to recognize that honestly, we're so lost, we're so broken, we're so poor that we are in desperate need of God's help. That's where God wants us to be, because when we are desperate for him and when we're dependent on God, that's when we're going to have more of God in our lives. When we're seeking him in prayer, when we're seeking him in the word, when we're seeking him in the Bible, right? When we're seeking more of God, we're going to find more happiness. And I know that this is so difficult in today's world because we're trying to find clout, right? We're trying to find significance. We're trying to find our happiness in different areas. But what Jesus is calling us to do is to be people who are humble, to be people who recognize our need and to be dependent on God in our lives. And there's a famous quote from Jim Carrey that I love. As people are chasing significance, as people are chasing wealth to bring them happiness, and chasing so many different things in our lives to bring us happiness. Here's what Jim Carrey says. Jim Carrey is a famous actor. If you don't know him, I feel bad for you. Famous movie, Dumb and Dumber, right? So super famous. But he said this. He said, I think everybody should get rich and famous and have everything they ever dreamed of so that they will know that it's not the answer. See, even Jim Carrey recognizes that like all these things in life, right? To get rich and famous and have everything that we ever dreamed of, these things, they didn't bring him happiness. If you look at his net worth, he's worth like $100 million, right? He has the ability to get anything he wants, and he has had everything that he wants. But even he's recognizing that it's not bringing him happiness. And Jesus understood this from the very beginning. Right? We can chase wealth. We can chase houses. We can chase what we're wearing, and we can try to find clout and significance and popularity. But if we're chasing all of these things and we finally get them, that's when we're going to realize that, man, there is so much more to life than just having things or being popular or being significant. I look at Kobe's life, right? Like he just passed away, and it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. But in this tragedy, we learned about what Kobe did. We learned about how impactful he was, that he transcended the game of basketball. Kobe was so much more than a basketball player. He impacted millions and millions of lives with this Mamba mentality. But what Kobe is recognized in his life too, what we see in Kobe's life is that he found happiness in helping other people. He found happiness in recognizing that he needed to be dependent on something else greater than himself. And if you go back to his earlier years in the NBA, man, there's so many quotes about him talking about his need for God, talking about his need for God in his life. And even the day that he passed away, right? They left from the airport just after they were at church that morning, taking communion, being with Jesus. Kobe recognizes this, right? And sometimes I think that we want the significance that Kobe had. We want to impact people the way that Kobe did. But to do this, man, we need the power of God in our lives. We need to humble ourselves and recognize that, man, we can't do all of this by ourselves. We need to be dependent on God. Now, Jesus shared a story about this. Jesus shared a story, an example of two different people in the Bible. And it's all about being humble versus being prideful. And here's what he said. He said, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other one was a tax collector. Now, Pharisees were religious people. Tax collectors were looked down on in society. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. He said, God, I thank you that I'm not like the other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance, and he would not even look up to heaven. But he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me. I am a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. See, the arrogant and the prideful man, the guy who was rich in his own spirit, that was the Pharisee. He was so impressed with himself and what he had done that it actually corrupted the way that he prayed. I mean, it says that he prayed to himself, right? Because when we're prideful, all we can think about is ourselves, and all we can think about is the great things that we have done. But then it focuses on this tax collector. See, tax collectors, they were looked down on in society. And what's great about the tax collector in the story is he recognized his need for God. He's saying like, man, I do not have any significance. I do not have anything to give. I completely need God. And he wouldn't even look up to heaven because he felt like he was just so low before God. And this is what it looks like to be poor in spirit, to be completely humble, to believe that, man, we don't have that much to offer as people. Yeah, we're smart. We can be good looking. Yeah, we can be popular. Nothing's bad about those things, but we have to recognize our dependence on God. That this life is too difficult, that there are things in life that we're not going to be able to overcome, that we need Jesus. And the worst part about being prideful, the worst part about being rich in your spirit is that you can become so self-focused that you become so ungrateful. Because when we're focused on ourselves, when we're rich in our spirit, all we're doing is we're focused on ourselves. And when you're focused on yourselves, all you can think of is how are people treating you? How are people talking to you? What's being done in you? How is everything impacting you? And when you're so self-focused and so self-centered and so prideful, it's going to start to tear down your relationships. And you're going to recognize that, man, life is not about me. Because when life is about you, when everything is focused on you, you're never going to find happiness. But when you're focusing on other people, when you're recognizing your dependence on God, that's when you're going to find true happiness. Because ungrateful people are unhappy people. But grateful people are always happy people.